Hey, what's going on? My name is Bim. This is the Lenovo Legion 5i that Lenovo was super kind enough to lend me last 2 weeks ago. We were able to do some synthetic benchmarks. We were able to do a lot of gaming tests on it. We typed a lot of things on it to test out the keyboard. We watched some media on it. And here's what we think of the Lenovo Legion 5i. So before I talk about the laptop itself, I want to quickly just say that the mouse that comes with it is really good. This is the M300 RGB gaming mouse by Lenovo. It's ambidextrous, 8000 DPI, 1000 Hertz polling rate, and RGB on the logo, which is, good to have. It's a nice to have. And it's free! It's free with the laptop. That's neat. Before we get into the specs, let's talk about the physical attributes of the laptop itself. So the plastic on the lid is nice and matte, doesn't attract any fingerprints, unlike the 3i. The 3i was a bit of a fingerprint magnet. Then you've got your logo here, the Legion logo, which is giving off like a nice hologram aesthetic, which I like. It's flashy, but not over the top. The back here is a little more textured than the rest of the body, which is pretty good. It gives a nice feel to the back. Then you've got here your joint, which is a little bit shinier plastic. Over on the side, you have a vent, USB port, audio jack, and then on the opposite side, you've got your power indicator. It is on. I think this is your reset, like you put a pin in there to reset it. And then you've got, I don't know what that little nub is for. Power indicator. And then you've got your USB port here. Most of your I/O is actually in the back. Couple vents, your Ethernet port, your USB-C, 2 USB ports, HDMI, power, and then your Kensington lock. Then underneath, you've got your intake, your air intake. And then putting it down, you could actually open it with one hand, which may not seem like a super big deal, but like some laptops, you have to kind of hold the bottom part down while you lift the lid up, and it doesn't have a lot of flex on the screen itself. Like when you lift it up, you do feel a little tension back here, and there is a little bit of flex on the screen, but nothing too worrying. It's not crazy, but it's there. All right, let's jump right into the specs. So the display is an IPS panel, full HD, 1920 by 1080, 500 nits of brightness, and 240 Hertz refresh rate. It also has 16 gigabytes of RAM, 1 terabyte of SSD storage, powered by an Intel Core i7-10750H processor and an NVIDIA GeForce RTX 2060 GPU. There are a couple things that I want to point out that I do like. So one is the physical shutter on the webcam. The keyboard actually also very good. You can hear it. It's nice and clicky. Typing on it is great. As someone who is used to mechanical keyboards, there's a time for mechanical keyboards, there's a time for chiclet membrane keyboards, and typing on this thing is a joy. It's much like the Lenovo Legion 3i, very similar keyboard, and I love using it. There's a numpad, full keyboard layout, which is good. The trackpad is actually also pretty good, very responsive. And also another thing that actually I think it really does deserve mentioning, because it surprised me. Oh, the mic's facing me, so it might sound a little faint, but trust me when I say that they cannot change society. Right? So instead of reflecting on themselves. For such a tiny thing. Yeah, so I thought mentioning the audio was, important, because as I was booting it up and I was, setting up Windows, and Cortana started speaking, I was so surprised at how clear and loud and full the volume was, like the audio quality was. So how does it perform? So here are some synthetic benchmarks. Synthetic benchmarks are good and all, but the real meat is in organic gaming benchmarks, and I tested about 5 games on the Legion 5i, and here are some of my results. Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which came out late last year, did about an average frame rate of 42.2 frames per second, a minimum dip of 34.2, and a maximum frame rate of 52.7. Now keep in mind, I maxed out all the settings just to see if it was possible to get good frame rates at maxed settings, and it's completely playable. AC Valhalla, completely playable by this machine. You just have to knock down some settings to medium or low if you want to achieve like a steady almost 60 frames per second consistently across the game. The game also ran at 79 to 81 degrees GPU, and the CPU ran up to, the highest I saw was 93 degrees, which is kinda toasty, gotta admit. Now, I also ran a couple fighting games, Grand Blue Versus and Tekken. I wanted to run Street Fighter 5, but like there was like a 20 gig update, so I didn't bother. It would probably perform very similarly. So fighting games these days, they try to lock at 60, and Grand Blue Versus and Tekken, you pretty much get what you expect, steady 60 frames per second. The Grand Blue game ran the GPU at 58 degrees and the CPU at 75 degrees. So the trend I'm seeing right now is that the CPU runs a little hot. So Tekken did a little better, running 61 degrees of the GPU and 67 degrees for the CPU. And we also tested Valheim. Valheim is an incredibly popular game these days. I'm having a blast with it. But the little caveat here is I recorded the test in the meadows. So when you start building your own base and you start putting in, forges and kilns and things like that, and big bonfires, your frame rate will dip. Especially if you've got a lot of geometry happening in a small space, your frame rate will dip. But in the meadows where the test was done, we were getting pretty much an average of 60 frames per second. There were a couple dips here and there to 35.7 and a maximum of 80 frames per second. The GPU ran hot at 77 degrees, and the CPU ran a little hotter at 80 degrees. So yeah, the trend continues. GPU is a little colder than the CPU, and the CPU does run a little toasty. Cyberpunk 2077, which is the game I really wanted to test on this thing. Cyberpunk is this generation's Crisis. So if you can run it, then you're in a pretty good space. I tested about 11,000, almost 12,000 frames on this thing, and it was playable at almost 40 frames per second. That's like the average, 40 frames per second. Minimum, I was getting 29.2, so about 30 frames per second, and a maximum frame rate of 47.9. And I did the test mostly right in the middle of the city, where there's the most lighting, most geometry, most people. And this is at the high preset with ray tracing turned off. Now the game ran the GPU at a toasty 80 degrees Celsius and an even toastier 96 degrees for the CPU. And that, not gonna lie, is pretty hot. That is, almost alarmingly hot, but it didn't seem to throttle the performance in any way. At least I don't think so. So yeah, it does. Like, Cyberpunk will run your game hot. I also ran Valorant on this system, so gamers who want to make the most use of their 240 hertz display will want to run something like Valorant, some popular esports games, twitchy, fast, run and gun, high accuracy kind of game. So I tested it out with Valorant, tested over 86,000 frames on this thing, and surprisingly, well, maybe not surprisingly, and this is like high preset, I got an average frame rate of 220 frames per second and a minimum dip of 118 frames per second. So still well over 100 frames per second and a maximum frame rate of 350.6. So that those 240 hertz, you're going to make, good use of that on this game. It did run the GPU a little hot at 81 degrees and the CPU at 93 degrees Celsius. So one thing is clear, the laptop runs the CPU hot when you're gaming. What surprised me when running a game like Cyberpunk is that in terms of thermals, this thing reached 96 degrees, which is pretty hot. And once it gets up to that temperature, you feel it here and here. Like it runs really hot. You could, like it's hot now and it's not really doing anything. Not hot, warm to the touch, I guess. Which I guess is normal for a laptop, but when it reaches temperatures up to 96 degrees, the CPU does, you can really feel it here. Like if you put your hand when you're typing after, you know, a gaming session, you feel the warmth. Like you can use it as a warmer. So there you have the benchmarks and the gaming tests for the Lenovo Legion 5i. This model starts, I think, at 52,000 pesos, almost 53. This particular one goes for around 90,000, like 89,000 something. The dollar values are going to be floating around here somewhere. I recognize that it's expensive. It's almost 100,000 pesos. That is, well, I mean, if you consider that a phone is almost that price, or yeah, there are 100,000 peso phones now, right? If you consider that, what can you do on that? This thing can play AAA games, can run Cyberpunk, the, you know, highly controversial Cyberpunk. It can play competitive games at 240 hertz. You know, if that kind of power and portability is important to you, and it comes with like a really good keyboard, really good audio, surprisingly good audio. If that kind of thing is important to you, then maybe 90,000 isn't that high of a price to pay for, you know, quality machine. So there you go. That is our review of the Lenovo Legion 5i. If you found this video informative, if you liked it, please drop a like. If you want to see more of the shit that we do, I promise, you know, I barely upload anything because life. I wasn't able to do a video of the 3i, which I had for 2 weeks because, you know, life. So I don't post a lot, so please just go ahead and subscribe. I promise not to bug you with my shit, but that would help me quite a bit. Oh, also, it comes with a free mouse. It comes with a really good mouse. For, you know, that price, comes with a good mouse, plus a laptop. What a deal. Anyway, like, comment, and subscribe, and I will catch you guys in the next one.